Okay. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvisha vahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Very good. Welcome back for our satsang, and welcome, of course, to many students attending these satsangs online and submitting questions. And it's really, I find it delightful to get questions from all over the place. And many of the questions, I'm pleased, the many very good, thoughtful questions. So what we'll do today is we'll alternate, as we have before, between online questions and questions from our local audience here. We'll start with some online questions. This is from Amit. It doesn't say where Amit lives. He asks, we commonly use this analogy of consciousness being equated to gold in the case of a gold bracelet, gold ring, gold necklace. Actually, not consciousness, but Brahman is our usual metaphor. That's okay. Forms are different, but gold is common. Correct. But wouldn't the gold molecules be different for each jewelry item made out of a given gold slab? And actually, in our prior class, we just discussed this. The use of metaphors in Advaita Vedanta, in fact, the use of metaphors in any teaching tradition, is the fact that every metaphor is defective. A metaphor that was perfect wouldn't be a metaphor. It would be the actual thing. So we deliberately use defective metaphors to teach. What choice do we have? We can't use perfect metaphors. If I tell you everything is Brahman, why? Because Brahman is everything. Not very helpful. So helpful to use metaphors. So the point here then is that every metaphor has to be properly used. And to do a scientific analysis of the molecules of gold is not in the spirit of the metaphor. We have to use the metaphors as the authors intended those metaphors to be used. The author certainly didn't. The author, in fact, didn't know anything about molecules, so this definitely goes outside. But Amit goes on to describe another point of view, which appears to be the point of view of Vishishta Advaita. Let me share with you his conclusion based on his misinterpretation of the metaphor. He concludes, just as gold is different because of the molecules are different, wouldn't it be true that the consciousness in every being is different? So just as gold, the gold in one part of a bar is different from the gold in another part of a bar. If you made a ring from this part of the bar and a bracelet from this part of the bar, they would be different according to this misinterpretation of the metaphor. And he uses this as to say that my consciousness is part of universal consciousness. Your consciousness is a different part of universal consciousness. Therefore, my consciousness and your consciousness are not exactly the same. So this is a second problem. First problem is a misinterpretation of the metaphor. Second problem is misunderstanding the fact that Atma, or consciousness, or Brahman for that matter, is partless. When we use terms like nirguna, nirakara, we refute any kind of internal differentiation. Consciousness has no internal differentiation. Therefore, you can't have parts of consciousness. It's not that your part is different from my part. There is one partless, undifferentiated consciousness simultaneously manifest in your experience and my experience. Let me say that one more time, and we'll move on. One partless, undifferentiated consciousness simultaneously revealing what's happening in your mind, what's happening in my mind. And this idea that there are different parts of consciousness is what is sometimes taught in Vishishta, Advaita, and some other traditions, but absolutely not in Advaita Vedanta. And it's easily dismissed. You know, how the analogy for consciousness is space. Does space have parts? There's an upper part, lower part, you get the point. Space is undifferentiated. You can't talk about parts. Same is true for consciousness. This is a question from Jacqueline, who lives in Vietnam. That's interesting. Jacqueline asks, how to get out of this samsara chakra, this cycle of life and death. And she comments that knowledge belongs to the mind, but what if an enlightened person has some problems with the mind? Like, nowadays, dementia is a main topic. It's a serious problem. So suppose an enlightened person gets Alzheimer's disease. Does that enlightenment go away? Good question. And actually, we've discussed it before. And the answer is a little surprising. So the question is, an enlightened person gets dementia. What happens to enlightenment? Well, first of all, we have to understand enlightenment is for whom? Not Atma. Atma was never bound in the first place. Getting enlightened doesn't help Atma. Getting dementia doesn't hurt Atma. These are conditions of the mind. So, mind is a natural feature of the world. A mind can be enlightened and enjoy the benefits of that enlightenment. A mind can be associated with a diseased brain, in which case that mind is not capable of enjoying the fruits of enlightenment. That's nature. Enlightenment doesn't erase nature. So, does an enlightened person's body have problems? How to avoid? Does an enlightened person's mind have problems? That's nature. Now you say, but what about enlightenment? Well, the teachings of Vedanta is that Atma is nitya mukta, eternally liberated, and enlightenment is to recognize your true self, Atma, as eternally liberated. That's all it is. So how does dementia affect Atma? Not at all. How does dementia affect the mind? In terrible ways, unfortunately, and that is nature. Just as the body is subject to all these problems, mind is no different. Okay, one more question online. We have taught that enlightenment is possible only through study of scriptures under the guidance of a guru, along with Atma Vichara. I just turn it around. Enlightenment is through Atma Vichara, supported by study of the scripture, as taught by a guru. Meditation and bhakti are important adjuncts, but they themselves cannot lead to enlightenment. This is, this is Sushama from Mumbai, and she gets it. That's exactly what I've taught many times. Meditation and bhakti are important adjuncts. Not just important, essential adjuncts. but they themselves cannot lead to enlightenment. Then she asks, and her question comes now, but there have been so many, I'll paraphrase this last part, so many enlightened sages in India who have never undergone formal study of scriptures and who have never had a proper guru to teach them. How did they get enlightened? Well, two issues here. One is, we said that the main way of gaining enlightenment is Atma Vichara, supported by scripture and guru. If you don't have access to scripture and guru, which is Sushuma's question, if you don't have access, if you are still capable of this Atma Vichara on your own. Now, you say, how can you do that? Well, there are apparently some exceptional people in the world who were able to do that. It's like geniuses, child prodigies. A kid who's 5 years old is playing the piano like this. There are prodigies in every realm of learning. There are such things as spiritual prodigies, spiritual geniuses, who were able to get it like that, and without a guru, without scripture, but with Atma Vichara. So they undergo the same process of self-inquiry. By the way, it would be incorrect to say they've had no access to scripture, because in ancient India culture, scriptures were embedded in the culture to such an extent that growing up in that culture, you would definitely have some minimal exposure to scripture. So we can presume that someone, based on that minimal exposure to scripture and based on being a spiritual prodigy, they were able to gain enlightenment without formal study of scripture, with the help of a guru. Now, she doesn't ask this, but I'll add it, one more question that comes. And the question usually goes like this: if so-and-so got enlightened without a guru or formal study of Vedanta, then why do I need formal study of Vedanta under the guidance of a guru? And allow me to be a little sarcastic, and that is, if you are as great as those saints and sages who are able to do it on their own, then you can go for it. But if you are an ordinary person like me, you've heard me say this, we need all the help we can get. Just very pragmatically, we need all the help we can get. Okay. Do we have questions? Here. Yeah. I need the microphone.
Just to continue that question, what about the vasana, they say? That is, from your previous birth, certain things that you would have done. Is that also a continuing thing, this getting enlightened? Or is it restrained to only this birth or something?
I'm not clear about your question.
They say vasana, that means some good things that you have done.
Yeah.
They carry overs. That
Yeah.
could actually be.
They say that the inclination for spiritual growth is due to blessings from karmas, good karmas in prior lives, correct? Yeah. Your question is?
Yeah, but that would they be also be? I mean,
that's an inclination.
Inclination, but
inclination doesn't mean enlightenment.
Yeah.
Right? You can be inclined to study nuclear physics, but the inclination doesn't make you an expert in nuclear physics.
Yeah, but there is nothing from residues from the previous life that can actually help in the speeding up the enlightenment.
In some extraordinary circumstances, possible. But let's go back to the prior argument. What benefit is it to us that some extraordinary person had some kind of unusual, extraordinary blessing from a prior life, and allowed them to gain enlightenment without going through the formal study under the guidance of a guru, what benefit is it to us to consider these extraordinary cases? In science, I think they use the term outliers. Through the analysis of these outliers, you learn something, but what you learn doesn't apply universally. So an analysis of outliers is not very helpful, and in our situation as well. Does that address your question? Go ahead.
I was just thinking that this path to enlightenment is a long path of sadhana and so on, and probably a birth will come and go in between. So would it not be a carryover, this enlightenment?
We don't know. How can we know?
Yes.
What we do know, and what is said in many scriptures by many teachers, is the fact that you and I are sitting here today is evidence of an incredible blessing. You know, just to reflect on this in a more general sense, the fact that we're still alive. You know, I think back in my youth, I did some really stupid things. Actually, not all stupid things, but there were 3 occasions where I could have been killed. I can distinctly remember these 3. I won't bore you with the details, but there were 3 occasions which I came this close to dying. And that's true for everyone. You may not even know the occasions. You know, if you're driving a car, you don't know that the guy who just cut across is drunk and could have hit you if you were 1 second earlier. So everyone has had these close calls with death. Yet we're sitting here. Secondly, why are we sitting here? Why aren't we sitting at home in front of the television set? or sitting in front of the computer doing some mindless browsing? All of us have chosen to be here now. That's unusual. There's something going on. Now, if you say, is it due to, this much we know, that there is an unusual blessing allowing us to be here now, having this satsang. And if you ask, is it because of what I did in the immediately preceding birth or thousands of births? We have no idea. We have no way of exploring any of that. Only thing we know for sure is what's happening right now. Okay. Another question here? Give her the microphone, please.
Namaste, Swamiji. A question regarding freedom from suffering. So if a mumukshu is on the path towards enlightenment, is freedom from suffering a byproduct of enlightenment, or does the person on the path experience freedom from suffering, or do you have to be enlightened before that clearly is going on?
So part of the problem is language. Enlightenment is freedom from suffering, which means to know that Vedanta says that I am Satchidananda Atma, which is utterly non-separate from Brahman, the substratum because of which everything exists. That kind of knowledge is not enlightenment. Why? It's conceptual knowledge, and it doesn't remove suffering. So we can say that enlightenment is the personal discovery of your true nature, leading to or resulting in freedom from suffering. Now, you asked about for a sadhaka, a spiritual aspirant on the path. I think it's usually true that spiritual growth leads you to suffer less and be more resilient. I think for most people, I think that's definitely true. You can see certain benefits in your life as you gain maturity. But that increased maturity does not remove the possibility of suffering. So suffering continues until that discovery of your true nature is as vivid as anything else. They often use the metaphor of a berry in your hand. If you have a fruit in your hand, when you know your true nature as clearly as you know that fruit in your hand, that immediate understanding of your true nature is what removes suffering. Did I answer you?
Thank you. Thank you.
One more question here. Over here.
Namaste, Swamiji. This goes back to the question from the person online regarding dementia and loss of, I guess, ability of the brain to comprehend this knowledge. You had mentioned before in one of your talks about this specific example of dementia and how there's value in cultivating release from that emotional dependence, right? And cultivating like a prayerful attitude and how that can be of value. And even if dementia takes away our cognitive abilities, we can still be in touch with our emotions.
Tricky. Most forms of dementia don't affect you only cognitively. Most forms of dementia also affect you emotionally.
Okay.
So dementia is not a purely cognitive decline. It's not merely losing your memory or forgetting where you put your keys and all of this stuff, but it affects different kinds of dementia, different degrees of dementia, but they pretty much affect us, including at an emotional level.
I see. Okay.
All right, let's take some more questions online. Here. This is a question from Ganesh, who lives in Secunderabad. He asks, everyone tries to minimize or avoid suffering. If God, the Creator, why did He create us in the first place so that there would be suffering? And I'm kind of skipping around in his question. My question is, if God is kind, why did God create us to suffer? Okay. And this happens to be a common misunderstanding with regard to the nature of who is Ishvara. He uses the word God. And too often we hold on to an image of Ishvara based on our childhood learning. When we're little children, mom and dad took you to a temple or, some kind of religious activities, and they may have told you something about who is God. Anyway, we learn something about God as children, but it's a childish understanding of Ishvara. And what frequently happens, in fact, I am shocked. I'm being very frank. I'm shocked at how frequently it happens that people grow into adulthood with a childish notion of who and what is God. So many other aspects of our understanding have grown tremendously. When you were a little child, you had a hard time with adding numbers, right? 2 plus 8 is what? So, as adults, you don't have a problem with that. Some people do, but we'll set that aside. But my point is that our intelligence grows with age if we are mature people. But for some people, and I said shocking, for a surprising many people, their understanding of who and what is God or Ishvara doesn't grow over the years. They grow up with childish notions of who and what is Ishvara. And that is the basis for this kind of question. Why, if God is kind, why did God create a world in which we suffer? Different religions will respond to this question in different ways. So in this Hindu tradition, we understand Ishvara, God, not as a kind, what would you say, some chachaji, some kind uncle in some heavenly domain who is watching over you and taking care of you, and which, by the way, is not dissimilar to how some Christians envision God. And it is definitely not a mature Hindu understanding of Ishvara. A mature understanding of Ishvara in the Hindu tradition is as creator, sustainer, destroyer. That's the obvious part. But with regard to our individual lives, which is what Ganesha's question, Gauri. Sorry. Question is Gauri. So Gauri's question is a personal question. Why, if God is kind, why did he create all this suffering in my life? So the answer to that question is in revising your understanding of who and what is Ishvara. So Ishvara is not a kind uncle in heaven. Ishvara is, in the words of in the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, Ishvara is karma phala data, the giver of the fruits of your own deeds. For your past good deeds, which means good deeds in this life and in prior lives, good things come into your life. Those good things are given by Ishvara. For your past mistakes in this life and prior lives, Ishvara gives you the consequences of those mistakes, which usually involve some suffering. So when you receive suffering in life, it's not that God is being unkind, but rather that God is giving you the results of your own deeds. So this is a more mature understanding of Ishvara. To gain that mature understanding of Ishvara, we need we need further learning. Children don't understand that. Children can't understand. This idea of karma paladata is a little sophisticated, not complicated, but it's something that little children can't comprehend. So no parent will teach, Mommy, why did I stub my foot? And mom is not going to say, because God is karma paladata and you must have done something in a prior. You get the point. That's not a suitable answer for a crying 5-year-old. So mom will come up with a different answer. Basic point here is we need to understand who and what is Ishvara in a more mature way. Bhagavad Gita is a great source of that kind of learning. This is a question from Jayantika. Doesn't say where she lives. It says Orlando. Jayantika lives in Orlando, Florida. If there is any, the question is there an order in which our karmas get fructified? She says, I hear that strong karmas, get fructified first. And I, in response to Rao's question, I said, we don't know this stuff in detail. There's no way of knowing this stuff in detail. She says, I hear that. Well, we hear all kinds of things. In a more serious manner, though, one scripture will say one thing about karma, another scripture will say something else. Don't think that the doctrine of karma is taught in a particular scripture in a very systematic way. That scripture doesn't exist. our understanding of the doctrine of karma comes from thousands of references to karma found in hundreds of scriptures, which don't even agree with each other. So what can we do? Even within a scripture, in Mahabharata is famous for conflicting explanations about the doctrine of karma. What can you do with that? Anyway, the principles of the doctrine of karma we understand in general, and it's extremely helpful to us. But to try to turn the doctrine of karma into some kind of spiritual science, to take this kind of detailed science-oriented approach to the doctrine of karma is unhelpful. Unhelpful is enough. One more question here. This is from Jnana Ranjan. Jnana Ranjan. Nice word. One who is devoted to knowledge is Jnana Ranjan. And I think it's a he. He writes, how do I know who is an enlightened being? You don't know. Period. There is no way whatsoever of knowing. The only one who knows if he or she is enlightened is that person himself or herself. You cannot tell by a person's behavior. There are many signs, and you can interpret those signs. You might interpret the signs incorrectly. So there's no rule about an enlightened in Bhagavad Gita and many other scriptures. You know, the behavior of an enlightened person is described again and again and again. An enlightened person, how many scriptures say an enlightened person has complete equanimity if they are praised or blamed? That kind of statement comes again and again. So if you find someone who is has complete equanimity, whether they're praised or blamed, should you assume that they're not, that they're enlightened? They might be deaf. You don't know. By observing their behavior, or they may not understand praise and blame. You know, there are so many reasons. Or they might be, they might have so much pride and arrogance that praise doesn't pump them up, and any kind of blame, they just anyway. You get my point, and that is, even though many scriptures say that an enlightened person is one who has equanimity towards praise and blame, by merely observing a person's behavior, those signs cannot prove or indicate without question whether or not a person is enlightened or not. The only person who knows is oneself, which is the next question. How does a person know that he or she is enlightened? And going back to a prior question, if you suffer, you're not enlightened. It's that simple. Of course, how to get free of that suffering takes a lot. It takes a lot of Vedanta to become free from suffering. Okay, are we doing on time? Not bad. This is a question from Raja Gopalan, who lives in Chennai. There is a modern-day scientific hypothesis about the existence of a multiverse. And hypothesis is corrected. We don't know, but there are scientists who postulate this. My question is there any scriptural reference in the Vedas that suggests the existence of multiple universes? What is the meaning of loka? If you go through, especially the Puranas, 18 Mahapuranas, you will find statements that suggest hundreds and thousands of different concepts of the universe. Here, let's generalize this question. Raja Gopalan is trying to make a connection between modern science and ancient scriptures. Are there places where they agree? Yeah. Are there places when they don't agree? Yeah. How does that help us? I understand, the curiosity of such a question, but the ultimate fact is science doesn't confirm what the scriptures teach, and scriptures can't confirm or deny what science teaches. These are independent realms, and there's no need for scripture to be supported by science, and there's no need for science to be supported by scripture. There may be points of agreement, there may be many points of disagreement. Also, it's important to note that scriptures, I just made reference to this, scriptures do not speak with one voice with regard to the origin and nature of the universe. Now, let me make this point. Scriptures are in complete agreement about absolute truth, about absolute reality, about what is non-dual Brahman, about what is Atma, your true nature. A proper study of Scripture will find that Scripture speaks with one voice with regard to this. In fact, the whole Brahma Sutra exists to demonstrate the fact that there is unanimity of vision with regard to these fundamental truths. But let me make the point. When Scripture speaks about absolute truths, fundamental truths, Scripture speaks with authority. When Scripture speaks about the nature of the world, Scripture does not speak with the same authority. Because Scripture is dedicated ultimately to these fundamental truths. Scripture is not the purpose of Scripture is not to tell you how many universes there are, how many lokas, how did the universe come into existence. And if you compare different scriptures, you'll find different descriptions of the origin of the universe and how many universes, how many lokas, how long do they last, how long do they exist. You will find various treatments of that. So, bottom line is science is an authority with regard to the nature of the world. Scripture is an authority when it comes to matters of fundamental truth. And to look for confirmation between the two is usually not very helpful. Okay? Do we have other questions here? Yeah, you'll need to take the microphone.
Swamiji, regarding recent discovery of artificial intelligence, that things going immoral and illegal, and maybe good things or bad things, what will be the implication of this in Vedanta?
I'm not quite sure about your question. Can you try to clarify it for me?
Artificial intelligence has gone to so many, leading to bad things like man. Man can be converted to monkey.
Artificial intelligence produces dharmic and adharmic materials.
Yes.
Fact. Okay, what is your question?
So that's the question. What is the implication on Vedanta?
What is the implication of Vedanta? I don't understand what you're asking.
Artificial intelligence is leading to a lot of immoral things and illegal things, and
and a lot of good
also,
and a lot of good things as well.
Yes.
So we don't focus on one or the other. Yes. I think you're asking what is a Vedantic perspective on artificial intelligence. So it's important to recognize that artificial intelligence is a powerful tool. right? And a powerful tool can produce dharmic or adharmic results depending on how it's used. Who is using it? You and I. You know, artificial intelligence doesn't have its own will, doesn't have its own agenda. You have to tell it to do something. You have to ask it a question. So you, not you in particular, but you in general, people are the ones who wield the tool called artificial intelligence. And if a person has a good intent, chances are they'll use that artificial intelligence in a dharmic way. And if a person has an immoral intent, then they can use that artificial intelligence in an adharmic way. So, from a Vedantic standpoint, artificial intelligence is no big deal. By the way, even in a lot of people misunderstand artificial intelligence. The word artificial is easy. The word intelligence is problematic. Artificial intelligence is not intelligent in the way you are at all. The way artificial intelligence works is utterly unlike how your mind works. Utterly unlike. There's no... you know what it is to figure out a problem, right? Tell me, would you figure out a problem like this? Let's. On my way home, should I stop at the market to buy milk or not? This is your question. And now you're going to figure out should you do it or not? This is a problem. So you can imagine the steps your mind would go through to make that decision. The steps your mind would go through and the steps artificial intelligence would go through are utterly different. And by the way, I'm not an expert in this, but just to suggest, an artificial intelligence program would calculate the statistical probability of people going to the market and people not going to the market. And based on the statistical probability of that fact and probably 1,000 other facts, the program would come up with an answer. You don't think in terms of statistical probabilities generally, unless statistics happens to be your field of study. But that's not normally how our minds work. So artificial intelligence is utterly unlike your intelligence, which means it's not as good as you think it is, basically. It comes up with some stunningly good answers. Turns out that statistics are a pretty good tool. And so with these statistical tools, artificial intelligence does a good job of seeming intelligent. But it's not it's not a human kind of intelligence. It's not like your intelligence. Okay, another question here? Anything else? Yeah, you have a question, please. Forgetting that.
So Swamiji, a couple of weeks ago, I think we were talking about the doctrine of karma and how that is not absolutely integral to Vedantic studies, and that one can not accept the doctrine of karma and still pursue Vedantic studies and even become enlightened.
Correct.
And I think it was a statement that sort of raised some thoughts in my head that you made was Vedanta just happened to take birth in a culture.
Correct.
So could it have taken a birth somewhere else?
It has.
Outside of?
The same, okay, that's a good question. Thank you. Let me try to address it. So in that discussion, I mentioned that the teachings of Advaita Vedanta are associated with the doctrine of karma due to a cultural accident. The sages, the ancient sages from whom the teachings of Advaita Vedanta come, they happen to live in ancient India, a culture which accepts the doctrine of karma. And I've suggested before that if these Vedantic teachings came up in a non-Hindu culture, then they could be expressed very differently without depending on the doctrine of karma. There is absolutely evidence of non-dualistic teachings outside of Hinduism. The ancient sages don't have a copyright, so to speak, on non-duality. You can find expressions of non-duality in Sufism, derived from Islam. You can definitely find expressions of non-duality in the teachings of Christian and Jewish mystics. And these are traditions that absolutely reject what we call the doctrine of karma. They don't believe in rebirth, and yet they profess some of the same teachings as the ancient rishis did. How can we understand that? Well, first of all, as I joked, no one has a private access to truth. What is true in ancient India is true in ancient Middle East and true everywhere else. So truth by nature is universal. So sometimes people will say, isn't it surprising that you find these same teachings coming up and you find these same non-dualistic teachings coming up in the teachings of Christian mystics and Jewish mystics and Sufism, etc. They say, isn't it surprising? I turn it around. I say, I'd be surprised if it didn't come up. Anyway, it's a universal truth. But I think what is... So there's no... To answer your question very specifically, the fact that non-dualistic teachings can arise in a non-Hindu culture, in a culture that doesn't accept the doctrine of karma, this is evidence that non-duality doesn't depend on a belief in the doctrine of karma. I'll just add one little bit here, and that is, even though the teachings of non-dualistic teachings can be found in other traditions, what you'll find is not very strong, not thorough, not methodical, not complete. So what is absolutely unique about this Advaita Vedanta teaching, you've heard me say before, it's not what it teaches, but how it teaches. So the same non-dualistic teachings can be found elsewhere, but nowhere else will you find the brilliant unfoldment of this wisdom that you find in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. Okay, let's take a couple more online questions. This is Chandrashekaran. Nice how people abbreviate their names. So Chandrashekaran becomes Chandru, who lives in Fremont, California. Question: when someone passes out, a doctor declares that the patient has lost consciousness. Does the medical term consciousness refer to the same consciousness as Vedanta? Obviously not. So the medical definition of consciousness, really speaking, is how responsive a person is to stimuli. They actually have a chart. There are different levels or degrees of consciousness, and it's levels or degrees of how well the patient can respond to stimuli. And of course that has absolutely no connection at all to our Vedantic understanding of consciousness. Interesting just to observe a very fundamental difference here. And that is, medical science, like all science, is based on objective observation. So the doctor is observing the patient. The doctor is here, patient is there. What is the orientation of Vedanta? Not objective, but subjective. Looking at our own private, personal experience. So for this reason, the use of the word consciousness among scientists and Vedantins, will be completely different. This is a question from Arju, who lives in Seattle, who had previously asked about how an enlightened person can worship, and he pursued a little further part of this question. How does a realized person differentiate themselves from personal forms being worshipped, like Shiva, Krishna, and Rama? So if an enlightened person understands the truth of non-duality, how can they tell the difference between Shiva, Krishna, and Rama? And some of you are laughing for good reason. And being enlightened doesn't make you dumb. Can an enlightened person tell the difference between an apple and an orange? So the point here is that non-dual truth does not apply to worldly experience. Non-dual truth is with reference to a fundamental reality and not an experiential reality. Let me make that clear. Experience, by definition and by nature, experience is not non-dual. It's a double negative. So experience is inherently in the realm of duality. Meaning, there's no such thing as there's no such thing as the experience of non-duality. You've heard that I bet somebody has written a book with that title, The Experience of Non-Duality. Do you see the problem? If you are experiencing non-duality, there's an experiencer and an experienced, which means there's duality. So there's no such thing as the experience of non-duality. Non-duality is not a matter of experience. Experience exists because of an underlying reality that happens to be non-dual. So the underlying reality, because of which this world of duality exists, is a non-dual underlying reality. So an enlightened person, if an enlightened person is talking about non-duality, in the same sentence they won't talk about Shiva and Rama and Krishna. They'll talk about one non-dual Brahman who is the source, underlying reality because of which everything exists, an underlying reality that is nirguna, free from qualities, that is free from any kind of internal differentiation. So an enlightened person can use language like that to talk about non-dual truth, non-dual reality. But if you ask an enlightened person the difference between an apple and an orange, the enlightened person is not going to say there's no difference. There's only there's a nice American expression, get real. So an enlightened person who's referring to the world of experience will respond appropriately. In the same way, with regard to prayer life is part of our world of experience. An enlightened person can certainly differentiate between Krishna and Rama and Shiva. The difference is that the enlightened person understands something you might not know, and that is that the enlightened person, that Rama, Krishna, Shiva, and everything else exists because of a non-dual underlying reality. Okay, here is a question from Brajesh, who lives in Singapore. It says, I, the consciousness, is the same as Brahman. Isn't this a matter of shruti, scripture, and yukti, reasoning, but not anubhava, experience? So we've said many times that all of Vedanta is based on these three bases, all of which are equally important. And that is scripture, the revelation of the ancient rishis, yukti, reasoning, and anubhava, experience. So Brajesh's question is that consciousness is the same as Brahman. Tattvamasi says that basically. Other Mahavakyas, Prajnanam Brahma, says exactly that. Prajnanam, consciousness, is Brahman. So this is the culminating teaching of Advaita Vedanta, and it's absolutely established in scripture. Then what is the role of yukti and anubhava? So revealed by scripture, what is the role of yukti? Can you prove that consciousness is the same as Brahman? Got a problem, right? Logical proofs are based on logical techniques such as inference. A good example of logic is inference. Look at how inference works. You see smoke rising from the mountain, you infer the presence of fire. This is the example that's most commonly given by commentators. And that inference is representative of all kinds of yukti, all kinds of reasoning. In that particular example, the conclusion there is fire, the inferential conclusion, the inferential knowledge of the presence of fire depends on the observation of smoke. Meaning that yukti is limited to the realm of the observable, like science. In fact, science is yukti, is it not? So science and reasoning are limited to what is observable. When we are talking about realities that are unobservable, what can science tell us about Brahman? Nothing, because Brahman is not an observable object. It's not like science can invent some kind of instrument to measure Brahman or even to measure consciousness. So science is limited to the realm of the observable. In the same way, reasoning is limited to the realm of the observable. You cannot prove that Brahman and Atma are the same. Then what is the role of reasoning? Well, if you come up with any argument that says Brahman is not the same as Atma, reasoning can dismiss your wrong conclusion. The purpose of yukti in Vedanta is not to prove, but to disprove wrong contentions. Oh, this is so important. Vedanta does not rely on reasoning to prove. Vedanta relies on Vedanta to disprove wrong conclusions. Very important. So actually, I think Brajesh didn't quite understand that. Most people don't understand that. That's not surprisingly. So he says, isn't that consciousness is the same as Brahman? Isn't this a matter of shruti and yukti? It's a matter of shruti, but notice yukti doesn't prove it. Yukti only dismisses any argument to the contrary about Brahman being the same as Atma. And he says also, and then what about anubhava? Can any kind of experience establish the fact that Brahman and Atma are one and the same? There's a big topic, we won't, and I'm getting a little tired here at the end of our session. I think we'll wind it up here. Experience, in fact, I'll go back to what we just said. Experience lies in the realm of duality. Experiencer, experienced. The statement that Atma is the same as Brahman is a statement of non-duality. And we just joked about the fact that you can't experience non-duality. Experience exists in the realm of duality. So how does anubhava establish the truth that Brahman is the same as Atma? Well, anubhava has kind of the same role as yukti. It's very useful in dismissing contrary argument. Actually, let me retract that. It's not helpful. Let's put it in this term. A Vedantic analysis of your experience. We just said experience is always dualistic. And that means any experience tends to support a principle of dualism. What Vedanta does is it doesn't depend on anubhava, but rather it takes anubhava as a subject of study. Vedanta analyzes experience to show how your experience of duality does not dismiss the truth of non-duality. I'll say that again, and this is quite philosophical, but that's the nature of the question. Brajesh's question was very sophisticated, philosophical, so we'll end with this observation, and that is, experience tends to support duality. Does your experience of duality dismiss the truth of non-duality? What Vedanta does is to analyze your experience of duality and to show how your experience does not contradict the truth of non-duality. So it's when we say that Vedanta depends on shruti, yukti, anubhava, when we say depend, it doesn't mean that yukti proves that Atma is Brahman and anubhava supports that Atma is Brahman. That's not what we mean. We mean that anything taught in Vedanta has to be consistent with shruti, yukti, and anubhava. So we don't use yukti and anubhava to prove. We use yukti and anubhava, we analyze to show the consistency of this teaching of non-duality. Okay, that's very abstract, I admit, but that's the nature of the question. This is actually a good time to conclude. I'm getting a little tired. Again, nice, here, show everyone, nice to have you all here. Nice to have the online students watching as well. Again, I'll invite you to send me your questions to SwamiT at arshabodha.org. If you're sending me that email, be sure to say Satsang Question in the subject line. That's how I have a lot of emails I have to separate. Anyway, thank you. Anyway, nice session. We'll conclude with a prayer. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat. Very good. See you next time.